In a quiet suburb of Columbus, Ohio, in the heart of Grove City, lived Stanley Meyer, a mechanical engineer whose life was about to transform in ways only the pages of science fiction could predict. His wife, Marilyn, remembers the inexhaustible energy and spark of curiosity in Stanley's eyes whenever he talked about engines and innovations. However, it wasn't just a passion for mechanics that drove Stanley. There was something deeper, a secret he kept under lock and key. Imagine a world where cars no longer rely on fossil fuels. A world where the skies are clear of any pollution and the engines operate in absolute silence, emitting no more than a whisper. Stanley Meyer dreamed of this world, and he was about to do something extraordinary, one that could not only change the course of automotive technology, but also the destiny of humanity. What would you do if you had technology in your hands that could revolutionize the world, but also put your life at risk? Stanley faced this question every day as he ventured into his garage. Stanley's journey began in the early 1970s, but it was in 1985 that his obsession with a mysterious project began to take alarming shape. He spent days and nights locked in the garage, muttering about calculations and schemes that Marilyn couldn't understand. She watched, initially curious and then increasingly worried, as the man she knew slowly turned into a stranger to her. Stanley became a man of few words, his eyes often lost in distant thoughts as they ate dinner in silence. The few times he spoke, it was to murmur about the urgent need to continue his work, about how close he was to a discovery that could change everything. However, what exactly this everything was, he never said. One night, Marilyn woke up alone in bed. Stanley's side was cold, indicative that he hadn't been there for hours. Worried, she got up and walked through the silent house to the backyard, where the early morning chill barely touched the tension building in the air. What she saw that night would haunt her for the rest of her days. Such an intense glow emanated from the garage that for a moment, Marilyn thought the sun had risen over the horizon at 3 a.m. She approached, her hand shaking on the doorknob, her heart beating so hard it seemed to echo through the silent neighborhood. Upon opening the door, Marilyn was instantly blinded by the light. She tried to call out to Stanley, but the light was so piercing, so overwhelming, that her words were lost in the glare, and then, as suddenly as it appeared, the light went out, leaving only darkness and the sound of Marilyn's labored breathing. In the days that followed, Stanley avoided talking about the incident, dismissing it as a simple experiment with a new electrical installation in the garage. But Marilyn knew there was more. Stanley's eyes hid a fear she had never seen before. And even more alarming were the visits they began to receive. Men in black suits with questions that seemed to know more than they should about what Stanley was doing. What was the secret that Stanley Meyer was so desperate to keep? What knowledge had he discovered that could attract the attention of forces even he could not understand? And most importantly, could Marilyn discover the truth before it was too late? Not just for Stanley, but for all of them. The questions are many and the answers are dangerous. Follow the incredible and true story of Stanley Meyer, the man who could have changed the world, but who found himself trapped in a game of power and knowledge, where not only the laws of physics, but the limits of humanity itself would be tested. Before we dive into Stanley Meyer's intriguing story, I want to ask you to do two very important things. Subscribe to the channel and like this video. This helps a lot to bring more content like this to you. Now get ready, because what comes next is a true story that seems straight out of a science fiction movie, but promises to challenge everything we know about innovation and the price of knowledge. Don't miss it. The year 1985 marked a turning point in the life of Stanley Meyer, a man who until then was known in Grove City for his warmth and brilliant mind. After years of working with conventional automotive combustion systems, Stanley stumbled upon something new, something that would completely consume him. With an energy that bordered on obsession, he closed himself in his garage, a place that would soon become his refuge and prison. This new project started as a harmless curiosity. Inspired by the oil crisis and growing environmental problems of the 1980s, Stanley began to question the sustainability of fossil fuels. He spent sleepless nights, reading studies and patents, combing the frontiers of human knowledge about alternative energy. But it was an unexpected encounter at a technology conference in Columbus that truly lit the flame of his obsession. A stranger, a scientist claiming to come from a prestigious European institution, shared with Stanley unconventional theories about water electrolysis. a process that could theoretically split water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen, efficiently enough to be a viable energy source. The idea of a car powered solely by water captured Stanley's imagination, not just as a mechanical advancement, but as a potential revolution for the world. With this new vision, Stanley transformed his garage into a laboratory. He began acquiring equipment, some of it quite expensive, and old car parts. Each night after dinner, he would retreat to his sanctuary, emerging only in the early hours of the morning for a few hours of sleep before heading to work. Marilyn, in turn, noticed a drastic change in her husband. He was thinner, his eyes were often red from lack of sleep, and his temper had become impatient and distant. The garage walls were soon covered with diagrams and notes. Stanley often talked about the possibility of creating a fuel cell that could somehow use sound frequencies to break down water molecules more efficiently. He was convinced he was on the brink of something great, something that could save the world, as he liked to say. But with this grandeur came great isolation. The friends stopped visiting, confused and a little intimidated by Stanley's new obsession. Marilyn increasingly felt like a stranger in her own home, watching with a mixture of admiration and horror as her husband disappeared under the shadow of his ambition. As the months passed, Stanley's obsession with his water-powered engine project began to bear fruit. He developed a prototype that, although rudimentary, showed real promise. It was an arrangement of tubes and wires that, when activated, produced visible bubbles of hydrogen gas from the electrolysis of water. Stanley, intoxicated with the euphoria of his initial success, began talking about his discoveries to Marilyn, who was trying to keep up with the scientific explanations that surpassed her understanding, but it was not just technical success that marked these first experiments. Strange things started happening around Stanley's garage. Tools disappeared and reappeared in different places. Important notes were found out of order or upside down, and electronic equipment suffered inexplicable failures. Stanley, consumed by work, ignored these setbacks or attributed them to tiredness and stress. One day, while working in the garage, Stanley experienced what could only be described as a paranormal phenomenon. As he adjusted the frequencies on his device, a hazy bluish light formed around the device, and for a brief moment, he swore he heard voices whispering in an unknown language. Frightened but incredibly motivated by this event, he began recording every aspect of his work, convinced that he was not only on the cusp of a scientific discovery, but also touching something deeply mysterious and possibly extraterrestrial. Marilyn, in turn, witnessed Stanley's physical and emotional deterioration. She watched him talk to himself, arguing fervently with voices no one else could hear. On moonless nights, she would notice dark figures watching their house from a distance, disappearing whenever she tried to get closer. The tension within the house grew exponentially, with Marilyn feeling increasingly isolated and fearful of the unknown that had infiltrated her life through her husband's ambitions. This scenario of unexplained discoveries and phenomena only deepened Stanley's mystery and obsession, taking him to a point of no return, where the line between genius and madness began to blur. With each successful experiment, with each supernatural event, Stanley sank deeper into the darkness of a world he barely understood, dragging Marilyn with him into an abyss of uncertainty and fear. It was a particularly cold November night when Marilyn witnessed an event that would forever alter her perception of reality and her husband's intentions. Stanley had spent weeks in seclusion, saying little during meals and returning to his garage to continue his mysterious experiments. Marilyn, despite growing fear and confusion about what was really happening, decided to confront him after noticing an even more drastic change in his behavior. Stanley seemed distant, looking through the windows at the yard with an expression of worry and anxiety. That night, as Marilyn was preparing dinner, she noticed that Stanley was unusually agitated, constantly looking at the clock and then at the yard. Uneasy about the situation, Marilyn decided to secretly follow him when he left the house after dinner, heading to the garage. As she approached, a low, continuous humming sound could be heard, growing in intensity as she approached the garage door. With her heart racing and a sense of impending dread, Marilyn peered through the dirty window. What she saw made her freeze in place. Stanley was standing in the center of the garage, surrounded by a series of pulsating lights emanating from a strange device in the center of the room. This device, covered in tubes and wires, emitted an intense light that seemed alive, pulsing in sync with the hum that now filled the air. Suddenly, the light converged into a single bright, almost blinding point. Stanley, with a look of triumph and terror, turned toward Marilyn, as if he had sensed her presence. Before she could react, a burst of light emanated from the device, throwing Marilyn backwards against the outer wall of the garage. The light was so intense that for a moment all she could see was pure white, and the buzzing sound was replaced by a deafening silence. When the light dimmed and Marilyn managed to regain her senses, she found Stanley passed out on the floor, the garage in disarray with papers and tools scattered everywhere as if a storm had passed through there. With difficulty, she dragged Stanley out of the garage, fearing the worst. He was alive but unconscious, and did not wake up for several hours, during which a panicked Marilyn tried to compose herself and understand what had happened. In the days following the light incident, Stanley remained in a state of near catatonia, speaking little and avoiding all eye contact. Marilyn cared for him while trying to process the trauma of what she had witnessed. But the peace was short-lived. One morning, while Marilyn was in the kitchen trying to prepare something Stanley could eat, she heard a steady knock on the front door. Upon opening the door, Marilyn was faced with two men dressed in impeccable black suits. They presented themselves as agents of a government organization, but did not provide further details about their identities or purposes. The men asked for Stanley and expressed a particular interest in his work, specifically mentioning the recent light event that had been detected by his sensors. Suspicious and still traumatized by the incident, Marilyn denied any knowledge of Stanley's experiments or any abnormal events. However, the men didn't seem convinced. They looked around, trying to see beyond the confines of the open door, their expressions rigid and unfazed. They informed Marilyn that Stanley was involved in activities that attracted the attention of multiple agencies because of the potential of his findings and the threat they could pose to national security. They made it clear that they were there to ensure that he did not proceed with any more of his experiments without proper supervision. Before they left, one of the men handed Marilyn a card with a phone number and instructions to call immediately if Stanley resumed his activities or if she noticed any suspicious behavior. The visit made Marilyn even more nervous and confused. She wondered how these men knew so much about what was going on in their secluded garage and what exactly they wanted with Stanley. The tension in the house grew, and Marilyn felt watched, not only by the strangers visiting her home, but also by eyes she could not see, hidden in the shadows that now seemed darker and deeper than ever. After the incident with the light and the visit from the mysterious men, Marilyn decided that she could no longer remain in the dark about Stanley's work. One night, while Stanley slept, still reeling from recent events, Marilyn summoned the courage to explore the garage, which had become her husband's exclusive domain. She knew that what she was about to discover could change everything, for better or for worse. With the key that Stanley hid in a kitchen drawer, Marilyn quietly entered the garage. Moonlight streaming through the dirty windows partially illuminated the interior, revealing a scene of controlled chaos. Papers covered almost every surface, and various equipment was scattered everywhere. In the center of the room, the device that had emitted the intense light was now disassembled, with its parts arranged methodically around it. Marilyn began looking through the papers, trying to make sense of the notes full of calculations and technical diagrams. She found a notebook that was more used than the others, apparently Stanley's laboratory diary, where he recorded each experiment, each success and failure. As she flipped through the pages, Marilyn began to understand the magnitude of Stanley's obsession. He had discovered a way to use the electrolysis of water to not only generate hydrogen as a fuel, but in a way that was far more efficient than anything previously known. Stanley believed this method could eventually replace all fossil fuels, a discovery that would have enormous implications for the world. Deeper in the notebook, Marilyn found references to experiments Stanley had performed with what he called resonant frequencies. He had discovered that certain sound frequencies could significantly increase the efficiency of electrolysis. However, these experiments seemed to have led to strange side effects, such as the unexplained lights and sounds that Marilyn had witnessed. Stanley wrote about voices he began hearing when working in the garage late at night, voices that gave him instructions or warned him about the dangers of his work. At the bottom of the notebook, a sketch caught Marilyn's attention. It was a representation of a humanoid figure with exaggerated, almost alien features. Next to the drawing, Stanley had written, "They are helping me, but at what cost?" This discovery shocked Marilyn to the core. She realized that Stanley's work had attracted the attention of not only government agencies, but perhaps much more mysterious and powerful entities. In the days following her discovery, Marilyn struggled to digest the implications of what she had found. She knew she needed to talk to Stanley, confront him about his findings and the helpers he mentioned in his diary. However, before she could find the right moment, the black-robed men returned. This time, they got straight to the point. They knew that Stanley had made significant progress in his research, and that he was potentially on the cusp of a transformative technology. They were also aware of the side effects of Stanley's experiments, including the sightings and communications he had experienced. The men explained that these phenomena were of great interest to certain divisions of the government, concerned with both the technological implications and the national security implications. They made an offer. Stanley should cooperate with them, working under the supervision of their agencies to develop his technology in a way that could be controlled and, more importantly, kept secret. In return, they would offer him and Marilyn protection from forces that might try to co-opt or suppress their technology. However, there was an implicit threat in his words. If Stanley refused, they made it clear that steps would be taken to neutralize any risk he might pose. Marilyn felt a chill run down her spine upon hearing the proposal. It was an impossible choice between safety and freedom. Stanley, still shaken by recent events and mounting pressure, found himself in a moral and existential dilemma. He knew he couldn't just abandon his work, but the idea of becoming a tool of the government and possibly other less understood entities was terrifying. The situation was further complicated by the fact that, as Marilyn now knew, Stanley was not alone in his experiences. The voices he heard, the unexplained phenomena, all suggested that there was more at stake than simply creating a new technology. It was a game of powers that transcended governments and possibly human understanding of the universe. As 1989 approached, Stanley and Marilyn Mayer's lives were no longer the same. The pressure to cooperate with government agencies and the fear of the unknown had transformed the couple's existence into a continual state of alert. However, a new element was about to complicate matters further: the public exposure of Stanley and his invention. Against the wishes of the agencies, and in an act of desperation or perhaps bravery, Stanley decided to reveal his discovery to the world. He believed that by making his technology public, he could protect himself from being silenced or controlled by dark forces, both human and otherwise. Through a well-known journalist who had shown an interest in emerging technologies, Stanley arranged a public demonstration and in-depth interview. The news of the engine that ran on water, capable of generating energy through electrolysis using a specific sound frequency, quickly made headlines. The demonstration was a success, attracting the attention of scientists, business people, and inevitably, government representatives. Images of a car running while connected to a simple water tank circulated around the world, provoking a mixture of admiration, skepticism, and palpable fear. For Marilyn, every phone call, every knock on the door now brought a new level of anxiety. The men in black clothes increased their visits, alternating between veiled threats and offers of protection. Stanley, for his part, felt torn between the triumph of his technical achievement and the weight of the consequences it had brought. However, the public revelation had another effect that Stanley had not anticipated. Interest groups, from energy corporations to eco-terrorist organizations, began to surround the couple, each with their own agenda. Some saw Stanley as a hero, others as a threat to be neutralized. And in the shadows, unexplained observations and incidents suggested that the entities that had inspired Stanley's invention were also monitoring developments. The atmosphere around Stanley and Marilyn grew increasingly charged as 1998 began. The repercussions of Stanley's public exposure had intensified, and the lines between allies and adversaries had become dangerously blurred. Against this tense backdrop, a tragic event was about to occur, one that would irrevocably change the course of their lives. One cold March morning, Stanley was found dead in his laboratory. The scene was grim. He was lying next to his beloved prototype, with evidence of poisoning. Local police, along with federal agents, quickly surrounded the area, declaring Stanley's death the result of a tragic accident resulting from his own experiments. However, Marilyn knew the truth was much more sinister. The autopsy revealed that Stanley had been poisoned by a substance that did not match any known compound, raising suspicions of murder. Marilyn, devastated by the loss and suspicious of the suspicious circumstances surrounding her husband's death, began her own investigation. She rummaged through Stanley's papers, looking for any clue that might point to whoever was responsible for his murder. Meanwhile, the pressure on Marilyn increased. She received constant visits from the men in black suits, now more insistent on obtaining any remaining research or prototypes from Stanley. They claimed it was to protect Stanley's legacy and prevent his technology from falling into the wrong hands. But Marilyn felt there were darker motives behind his actions. Tensions reached a peak when Stanley's brother Stephen was also found dead under mysterious circumstances. Like Stanley, Stephen had been a support to Marilyn during difficult times, and his death just weeks after Stanley's seemed more than a coincidence. Afraid that she would be next, Marilyn decided it was time to take drastic action. She began compiling all of Stanley's evidence and notes, preparing to flee and protect what was left of her husband's revolutionary research. Stanley Meyer's story, which began with a vision of a better world, had turned into a cautionary tale about the price of knowledge and the power of the shadows that move behind the scenes of innovation and progress. Marilyn was alone now, carrying the weight of loss and a dangerous truth that needed to be protected at all costs. With Stephen's death, it became apparent that the forces that had silenced Stanley were willing to eliminate anyone who stood in the way of their dark goals. Paranoia and fear became constant companions for Marilyn, who knew the only option left was to flee. On a rainy night shortly after Stephen's funeral, Marilyn packed what she could into an old suitcase, including Stanley's most important notes and research. She also took the recording devices Stanley used to document his experiences, hoping that if something happened to him, the truth wouldn't die with her. With her car loaded and her heart heavy, Marilyn left Grove City behind, driving with no fixed destination but with the intention of hiding away from those who might want to silence her. Marilyn chose Texas as her refuge, a place where she hoped the vastness would offer some kind of anonymity. She rented a small house in a remote town, using a false name and paying in cash to avoid leaving a trace. There she set up a small office in a locked room, where she spent days and nights reviewing Stanley's notes, trying to piece together the puzzle he had left behind. Life in isolation was not easy. Marilyn struggled with loneliness and increasing paranoia. Every car that passed, every knock on the door made his heart race. She had few contacts with the outside world, except for occasional visits to a local library, where she used the computer to send encrypted emails to investigative journalists she believed she could trust. Marilyn was determined to expose the truth about Stanley's death and the forces that continued to haunt her. As Marilyn hid, her determination to unravel the mystery behind Stanley's research and his death only grew. She compiled a detailed dossier, combining Stanley's laboratory records with her own observations and the strange occurrences that had marked the last years of their lives together. She discovered that, in addition to the technological and scientific implications of his research, Stanley had inadvertently touched on issues that attracted the interest of secret organizations, possibly even non-human entities. Marilyn also began to make connections between the paranormal incidents reported by Stanley in his diaries and similar accounts from other parts of the world, suggesting that what Stanley discovered could be part of something much larger and more complex than any conventional theory could explain. It was as if he had found a key to a door that should remain closed, a door to knowledge that transcended human understanding and that attracted both curiosity and danger. Determined not to let Stanley's death be in vain, Marilyn planned how she could share her findings safely. She established contacts with a small group of trusted scientists and researchers, as well as investigative journalists, preparing for an eventual public revelation that could, she hoped, protect her from future reprisals by bringing the truth to the light of day. However, the fear that her information could fall into the wrong hands always tormented her. Marilyn implemented numerous security measures, including advanced encryption systems and communications protocols that ensured only the right people could access her discoveries. She knew she was in a race against time and against unknown adversaries who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill. Through it all, Stanley Meyer's legacy remained a beacon of possibility and danger. Marilyn became the guardian of this legacy, determined to reveal the truth, not only to clear her husband's name, but to alert the world to the profound and disturbing implications of his research. Stanley and Marilyn's story, intertwined with Revolutionary scientific discoveries and elements of conspiracy and mystery would stand as a testament to the human quest for knowledge and the shadows that search can reveal. At the end of this intense and revealing journey through the life and legacy of Stanley Meyer, we are left with a mixture of admiration for his genius and a deep reflection on the risks that true knowledge can bring. Stanley's story, from the innovations that promised to revolutionize the world to the mysterious events that surrounded his work and his death, leads us to question: how far are we willing to go in the name of science and technology? And what happens when the knowledge we seek opens doors that perhaps should remain closed? I'd like to know your opinion. Do you think the benefits of Stanley's discovery were worth the risks? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our future stories. Your participation is crucial for us to continue exploring mysteries as fascinating as this one. Stay with us, as there are many more stories to tell and secrets to uncover. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.